You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 530th episode of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, with the last episode, we did a bit of a post-mortem on the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. But with this show, we, like the armies, are leaving Kennesaw behind and moving on to the next chapter in the story of the Atlanta campaign.
The Federals' frontal assaults at Kennesaw Mountain on June 27, 1864, in which the Yankees suffered some 3,000 casualties compared to just over 1,000 for the Confederates, were William Tecumseh Sherman's biggest blunder of the campaign. But his characteristic optimism resurfaced when he received word on July 3rd that the rebels had abandoned their lines at Kennesaw.
As you guys know, the Confederate commander, Joe Johnston, had pulled the Army of Tennessee out of its lines at Kennesaw Mountain because of the threat posed by Sherman's flanking maneuver to the south, beyond the rebels' left flank. After the failed frontal attacks at Kennesaw, Sherman had returned to his preferred strategy of maneuver, and on July 3rd, he got the news he'd succeeded in turning the Confederates out of their position at Kennesaw Mountain.
Sherman believed that Joe Johnston would now hustle his forces south in order to get across the Chattahoochee River as quickly as possible, and this, Sherman anticipated, would present the Federals with the opportunity to strike the rebels, quote, in the confusion of crossing the river.
And so, on Sherman's orders, George Thomas, with the Army of the Cumberland, swept into Marietta from the west and turned southward in pursuit of the Confederates. 14th Corps in the center followed the tracks of the Western and Atlantic Railroad, while 4th Corps advanced to its left and 20th Corps on its right.
To the west, James McPherson and John Schofield, with the other elements of Sherman's army group, the Army of the Ohio and the Army of the Tennessee, continued southward along the Sandtown Road. Sherman hoped they might strike the flank or rear of the rebels' retreating column.
Thomas's troops encountered a small enemy rear guard just south of Marietta, and although the fighting never rose above the level of sharp skirmishing, the Federals nevertheless made only slow progress against stout Confederate resistance. By late afternoon on July 3rd, as the Yankees neared Smyrna Station, 4 miles down the railroad from Marietta, rebel opposition stiffened to such a degree that the Federals deployed an entire division in line of battle. However, by that point, it was so late in the day that the Yankees would have to wait until the next day to press the issue.
Meanwhile, continuous skirmishing that day had also slowed the Federals' progress off to the west on the Sandtown Road, and so, across the board, Sherman's hopes of a lightning-quick pursuit of the retreating rebels on July 3rd had been dashed by unexpectedly strong Confederate opposition.
The Federals' pursuit of the retreating rebels ran into unexpectedly strong opposition on July 3rd because, unknown to Sherman and contrary to his expectations that Joe Johnston would hustle his forces south to get behind the Chattahoochee as quickly as possible, well, the Confederates actually had prepared 2 defensive positions north of the river.
The first was known as the Smyrna Line because after pulling out of their Kennesaw lines, the Confederates retreated to a position along an east-west ridge that cut across the railroad at Smyrna. Its right flank was protected by Rottenwood Creek and its left by Nickajack Creek.
Wing Loring's Corps, which was the fallen Bishop General Leonidas Polk's old command, held the right of the Confederates' Smyrna line, while William Hardee's troops occupied the center. John B. Hood's men stood on Hardee's left, with a force of Georgia State Militia on their left to the west.
As usual, Joe Wheeler's cavalry covered the Army's right, while William Jackson's horsemen covered the left.
Sherman still thought Joe Johnston would hustle his forces south of the Chattahoochee as quickly as possible, and so, as far as the increasingly determined Confederate opposition encountered on July 3rd, at 6:45 that evening, Sherman messaged George Thomas, saying, quote, "The more I reflect, the more I know Johnston's halt is to save time to cross his material and men. No general such as he would invite battle with the Chattahoochee behind him."
In other words, Sherman believed any Confederate stand north of the Chattahoochee would just be a temporary delaying action, while Johnston hustled his wagons and his troops south across the river.
But in thinking that Johnston wouldn't make a determined stand north of the Chattahoochee, Sherman somehow managed to forget that already in the campaign, the Confederate commander had fought with his back to the Oostenaula River and had tried to make another stand with the Etowah just a short distance to the rear of his army. At any rate, still believing that Johnston's only thought was to escape across the Chattahoochee as quickly as possible, Sherman told George Thomas that the Federals had, quote, "the best chance ever offered," end quote, to catch the rebels either at the riverbank or in the midst of crossing the Chattahoochee and inflict a ruinous defeat on them.
In any case, a day of skirmishing along the opposing lines on July 4th produced relatively few casualties, although one of those was Alfred Vaughn, a brigade commander in Cheatham's division.
As you guys will recall, Vaughn's Tennesseans played a major role in the Confederate defense of the Dead Angle at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain.
Here, on July 4th, Vaughn and his men were stationed in the center of the Smyrna line with the rest of Hardee's troops. Vaughn and his Tennesseans were posted in support of an artillery battery, and when some Yankee guns fired on the rebel battery, one of the enemy's shells overshot its target and wounded Vaughn in the left foot. The wound led to the loss of his leg, and he was out of action for the remainder of the war.
A shell from the enemy's battery came whizzing through the air over my line and exploded just as it struck my foot in the ground, tearing off my foot and making a hole almost large enough to bury me in. My staff were lying around under the shade of the tree, but none of them were struck by the shell or any of its fragments. Colonel Dyer, who was standing over me at the time, had nearly all his clothing torn off, not by the shell or its fragments, but by the gravel that was thrown up against him. He received 17 flesh wounds, none of which proved very serious. The shock from the explosion of the shell was very severe, yet the tearing away of my leg was accompanied by neither pain nor the loss of much blood. In addition to the loss of my foot, I received another wound on my other leg, which was rather remarkable. I had a cut below the knee, about 4 inches long, and down to the bone, as smooth as if it had been cut with a sharp knife, yet neither my pants nor underclothing were torn. None of us were able to conjecture what made this cut. As soon as it was known that I was wounded, the surgeons of my brigade and division came to my assistance and bound up my wounds as best they could and gave me some morphine and whiskey. I was then put in an ambulance and started to the field hospital. In going to the hospital, I passed by General Cheatham's headquarters, who, hearing that I was wounded, came out to sympathize with me and suggested that as I was looking very pale, he thought that some stimulant would do me good and gave me a stiff drink. I then began to feel pretty good and proceeded on my way to the hospital. I had not gone very far when I passed General Hardee's headquarters. He had heard of my misfortune and came out to see me. He also said I was looking very pale and that I ought to have some stimulant, and gave me a big drink. I continued to feel better and again started toward the hospital, and in short time passed General Joseph E. Johnston's headquarters. He came out to see me and also said that I was looking very pale and that some stimulant would do me good. He happened to have some very fine apple brandy and gave me a big drink, and down it went. From this time on, I knew nothing until I awoke on the platform at the station in Atlanta at sunrise the next morning. Brigadier General Alfred J. Vaughn, Brigade Commander, Cheatham's Division, Army of Tennessee.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man, an 8-episode series, now streaming on Disney+.
A superhero remake, not exactly what we'd expect from an Oscar-winning director.
Action! Simon Williams, audition for Wonder Man.
I'm gonna need you to sign this, assuming you don't have superpowers.
I'll never work again if anyone found out.
My lips are sealed.
Marvel Television's Wonder Man. All 8 episodes now streaming, only on Disney+.
Choice Hotels get you more of what you value. Here's a little tune to help you remember. Same drive, different day. Don't you wish you were getting away? Pack your bags and come on through. Texas, Ohio, Alaska, we're up there too. Comfort Inn, it's calling your name. Save on the stay. Oh, and free waffles are yours to claim. Well, I hope you like my little song. Book direct at choicehotels.com.
Vaughn's wounding and fantastic story notwithstanding, a day of skirmishing along the opposing lines on July 4th produced relatively few casualties, but did yield an important result.
That's because, to the west, McPherson's veteran Federals roughly handled the Georgia State Militia facing them, and the Yankees pushed across Nickajack Creek, threatening to cut the militiamen off from the rest of the rebel army.
Faced with this danger on his left, Joe Johnston issued orders for his army to abandon the Smyrna line during the night and march 6 miles to the south, to the second of the defensive positions north of the Chattahoochee.
And so, by the next morning, the morning of the 5th, the rebels were safely inside the works of what came to be called the Shoup Line, after the officer who had overseen its construction. Well, that morning, the Federals, pushing southward in pursuit, were astonished when they came up to the Shoup Line. The impressive set of fortifications had been designed by Johnston's chief of artillery, Brigadier General Francis Shoup, and 1,000 impressed slaves had been laboring on them for 2 weeks. This new line was 6 miles long and a mile deep, with its right and left flanks securely anchored on the riverbank. While the Confederate infantry and artillery manned the works, Johnston dispatched the rebel cavalry to the southern bank of the Chattahoochee to guard crossings up and down the river. The line itself covered the railroad bridge and 3 pontoon bridges that the Confederates had constructed.
In addition to the usual trenches, the rebel works included a series of redoubts made of logs and packed earth up to 12 feet thick. A stockade wall of logs linked these redoubts, which stood about 80 feet apart.
Joe Johnston was so confident in the strength of this new line that he felt certain he could hold Sherman north of the Chattahoochee, quote unquote, a long time.
Sherman also admired the Confederate defenses. Riding down from Smyrna on the morning of July 5th, he viewed the rebel fortifications from a hill near Vining Station, about 2 miles from the river. He thought the enemy works were, quote, one of the strongest pieces of field fortifications I ever saw.
But from the same hill, Sherman glimpsed something else. With, quote, his eyes sparkling and his face aglow, according to one witness, Sherman saw for the first time in his 2-month-long campaign the spires and rooftops of Atlanta, beckoning from just 8 miles away.
James Connolly was a 22-year-old lawyer from Charleston, Illinois, who joined the 123rd Illinois in 1862. Rapidly promoted to major, Connolly served for 3 years with the Army of the Cumberland. In a letter to his wife, Mary, dated July 12, Connolly recounts his pleasure at his first sight of Atlanta.
At Chattahoochee River, July 12, 1864. Dear wife, mine eyes have beheld the promised land. The spires of Atlanta are glittering in the sunlight before us, and only 8 miles distant. On the morning of the 5th, while riding at the extreme front with General Baird and eagerly pressing our skirmishers forward after the rapidly retreating rebels, suddenly we came upon a high bluff overlooking the Chattahoochee, and looking southward across the river, there lay the beautiful Gate City in full view. And as the soldiers caught the announcement that Atlanta was in sight, such a cheer went up as must have been heard even in the doomed city itself. In a very few moments, Generals Sherman and Thomas were with us on the hilltop, and the 2 veterans for a moment gazed at the glittering prize in silence. I watched the 2 noble soldiers. Sherman stepping nervously about, his eyes sparkling and his face aglow, casting a single glance at Atlanta, another at the river, and a dozen at the surrounding country to see where he could best cross, how he best could flank them. Thomas stood there like a noble old Roman, calm, soldierly, dignified, no trace of excitement about that grand old soldier who had ruled the storm at Chickamauga. Turning quietly to my general, he said, "Baird, send up a couple of guns, and we'll throw some shells over there," pointing across the river. The artillery came thundering along through the long lines of men, and in 15 minutes from the time our line of skirmishers reached that hilltop, a parrot shell went screaming from the high point and burst beautifully on the south side of the Chattahoochee. Major James A. Connolly, 123rd Illinois Infantry, Wilder's Lightning Brigade.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Decision in the West, The Atlanta Campaign of 1864 by Albert Castell.
You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org. Also at the website is info about how to join the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and help support the podcast in that way.
Then, as we wrap up this episode, just a reminder that the music you hear at the start and at the end of every show is from the song Midnight on the Water.
And we use it with the kind permission of Spiritwood Music.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.